if we talk just about the state of Montana, one of the things you need to know is that not only do we have state jurisdiction in some instances, but we also have 7 different kinds of tribal jurisdiction, all distinct, but very similar in their nature as far as jurisdiction goes. And the issue of jurisdiction when you're dealing with an Indian person sometimes can be a real issue as far as when you ask yourself, what happens to this victim or what happens to the perpetrator? Especially if the crime was committed on a reservation and it's not viewed as a felony in their eyes, it's only viewed as a misdemeanor, but if they committed the same crime on the outside on state grounds, it would be viewed as a state felony. So there are some issues out there as far as who you're working with if you come across someone that's from a diverse culture. The Native people across the United States have realized, and I do mean that word realized, about the last 10 years that we have an epidemic problem with violence in our communities. And when we first started doing education in this area, we were talking only about spouse abuse. We were not giving it a broader context. But we're at the point now with education and internal examination and realization that we have a problem with violence. It's not just spouse abuse. We have a problem with violence in our communities. And the violence is intergenerational. It's affecting more than just the two adults or the adult, the child, that might be in the immediate criminal action. And because of the cultural context that we live in, the extended family, the violence touches many, many relatives. It's not just the core group that's involved. It's like water. When it touches a paper towel, it goes out and it touches everyone. So we have generations that have this knowledge and this history of being exposed or experiencing direct violence. And the issue for us today as educators and interveners and prevention specialists is, what are we going to do about that? If we know that it is in our midst and we can finally come forward with a voice and say, we have a problem that's epidemic in our communities with violence. It's not just spouse abuse, it's violence in all forms. What are we going to do about it? That's the jumping off point today that I wanted to convey to you, is that inside of Indian country in our communities, we have a different conceptual view of addressing problems. And oftentimes it is entirely different than what the dominant society perceives as what needs to be done. And where they're at now in Indian country in the communities is they want to view the family as a unit as opposed to a single isolated individual versus individual action. I think that's a critical cultural concept for you to consider if you're working with Indian families, is that oftentimes what's happening to them isn't viewed as an individual action. It's viewed as a unit action affecting more than just the individual. And that becomes really critical for treatment specialists who are not familiar with Native culture, because oftentimes what happens, and I experienced it as a judge, is that you'll have individuals that are not involved in the immediate incident calling you up and asking you questions. What's happening with this? What's going on with him? What can I do? And you might be a little bit confused about that, but that's the extended family experience again of everyone knowing that this thing is happening and maybe not saying anything about it, but when it finally surfaces, inquiring as to what they can do or how can the problem be solved. And there isn't an easy solution oftentimes in our communities because we have generations that have had experience with violence. 2 incidents I wanted to bring to your attention about the conflicting jurisdiction problems. In North Dakota in 1992, there was a family. The mother was an enrolled member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, and she was married to a non-Indian. I believe he was Hispanic. And they sometimes lived in Bismarck, sometimes they lived right on the reservation. And her family and everyone in the community knew that the man was a batterer. And there had been attempts in the past at family intervention, not going through the authorities, but just the family generally trying to assist their family member with disengaging from the individual or trying to address the violence. And each time that a violence incident happened, the man would step outside of the reservation boundary knowing that it was a situation of limited jurisdiction. So the tribal authorities were not able to go and arrest the man or serve a restraining order if he was living, just 1 foot off of their jurisdictional boundary. At the same time, if they moved into Bismarck They have a Indian community there called Mandan or Mandaree, something real close to Bismarck. It's real close to that. And an isolated incident would happen there, and he would move to the reservation, and that would stop the state authorities from going in. At that time, they were not communicating well. That, you know, cross-jurisdictional, cross-deputization wasn't part of the conversation. And this continued for a period of 5 to 10 years. And when the woman and her 5 children lost their lives, they were still in the midst of this jurisdiction discussion about who's going to do what. And even the federal authorities at that point would not look at the case because it hadn't been elevated or didn't fall under the Major Crimes Act, so they could take exclusive jurisdiction over it. And one day, the man took a gun and went to the trailer. They were living at that point in an isolated part of the Standing Rock Reservation, and shot the woman and 4 of the children, and then shot himself. One of the children survived, and it was a 1-year-old baby that was shot in the face, and he lived about 30 days, and then he died. And this hit the national newspapers in Indian Country. I don't think it hit the Missoulian or the Billings Gazette or any other paper in the state of Montana. But this is just an example of some of the things that go on out there when everyone should be doing something that's in a position of authority, and it doesn't appear that anything is being done. And that's the real issue out there for victims that are very active, is sometimes authority can present a picture of almost impossibility. It appears that they're there for you, but when it comes down to it, and I appreciate what the officer said yesterday, that oftentimes if a perpetrator wants to find the victim, they're going to do that. And that's the sadness about this field, is that in Indian Country, we realize that as well. We have the same incidences as the larger society of stalking, et cetera, that go on continuously, and it's a headache for the entire community because it immobilizes people. And that, you know, it is an issue that we talk about consistently in training sessions when people are trying to develop community plans. Another incident happened just 2 weeks ago on the Blackfeet Reservation. That's my reservation, and it was a very sad situation because it touched my family. I have a distant relative, and he has, it really isn't a relative, but this young man was adopted into our family, so we view him as a relative. And they have a history of alcohol. They also have a history of violence, of just being violent at different points when they're under the influence. And they had a grandfather. He's still alive. He's 94 years old, and he's very ill. We realize that his days are numbered. And he had a stroke, and so he was in the hospital. And when one of our elders becomes ill or their life is threatened, everyone gathers and surrounds them. And a lot of things come out that are highly charged emotionally during these times of stress when we're going to lose one of our elders because we have so very few left. Well, the 2 young men were arguing, having a difference of opinion about what was the proper care for this man that was in the hospital. And it carried over into a conversation, but the conversation was influenced by alcohol. And they had a fight. And one man hit the other man with a bat and knocked him to the ground, and this is when no one was around. And the man laid there for the next 2 and 3 hours. And the people that were at the party that were also drinking thought that the young man laying on the ground was passed out, and he wasn't. And so when the morning started to clear about 4 in the morning, someone went over and tried to wake him up, shake him, and he wouldn't move. And they thought that he still was heavily under the influence, and they continued to jar his body and shake him up and drag him around. And then they realized that there was something seriously wrong, and they called an ambulance, and he was brain dead by the time he got to the hospital, and he lived about another 8 hours. It was a very unnecessary death, and now there's a young man in jail facing second-degree murder charges, and our family that is related to the man in jail is experiencing all kinds of shock and grief and shame about how can something like this happen in our midst? Why did it happen? Can we do anything about it? Because not only did that incident happen, but now the father of the young man in jail is having a difference of opinion with the adopted mother of the man that died. And what I'm seeing culturally is that they want the family to pull together behind the young man that was arrested and forget this death out here. And I'm saying to my family members that's not directly involved, we should refuse to not acknowledge that somebody died unnecessarily. And once again, here's the issues that we've suffered with historically of alcoholism and violence. And the issue for the tribal council, not just for the family, but for the council and the whole community, is what are we going to do about this problem in our midst? Are we doing anything about it? And that brings me back to treating the family as a unit issue and viewing these things as a total community response as opposed to a programmatic response. The program response is just part of it, but the entire community has to buy into that response and support it and participate in it and practice what it's designed to do. Or really, you have programs operating in a vacuum. They're operating in an isolated context, and we just cannot afford to do that anymore, especially in our communities in Indian country. Now, as far as law enforcement goes, it has only been since 1986 that a lot of tribal jurisdictions started to draft and adopt domestic violence statutes. And the first one in Montana was the Blackfeet Reservation, and it was put together by Christine Bird, who came back from Portland after many years of working in that community as a social worker. And she had experience working with domestic violence and knew that there was a problem in our community. So she started working with the government and different law enforcement officers and judges and put together a domestic violence statute. What they realized is that this statute couldn't be written so narrowly that it would only address the perpetrator and the victim. Instead, because of our extended family, and again, this is a cultural way of drafting legislation, we had to make sure that the language was worded properly so that it would reach the extended family situation. Because in some violence instances in our families, the perpetrator, the batterer, goes after the spouse, but the spouse has a lot of relatives and they might intervene. The batterer goes after them. If the spouse runs to a relative's house, that, you know, it's like the three little pigs. He'll huff and he'll puff and he'll blow the house down, he'll blow the door down. It doesn't matter whose house the victim goes to. It's going to extend there. So the statute was written to include different forms of violence, and it also allowed the police, it required the police, first of all, mandatory arrest without question. But it also allowed them to pursue the batterer if they had probable cause enough to believe that there was an incident that happened and somebody was injured. It allowed the officers to pursue even after the batterer left the original scene of the crime. And so that means that an hour later, if the officers came across that individual, if they had original probable cause, they were able to arrest that person and they wouldn't get away. Now, they stretch it sometimes, and again, judges in the court systems have to deal with that, whether or not they've gone too far with that hot pursuit issue. But initially, when the statute was implemented, it sent some shockwaves through the community. And there was a lot of rumbling and grumbling. And what we realized is that we had to deal with some of the attitudes that were inherent and historically in place, not only amongst the male component, but also the female component, because we had such a history of women and female children that grew up in the midst of being victims of violence that it was really difficult to convince them that something like this would work. So a lot of education had to be done. But on the law enforcement end, we had to deal with attitudes of police officers who actually were active batterers, but they were silent batterers. Their fellow officers knew that these men had, you know, a propensity for violence when they were on duty and in their own family, but they never said anything about it or they covered it up. And we had to address those issues in the midst of training by addressing attitudinal change. And that was really difficult. I was one of the early trainers and I felt very threatened because a lot of them were my own tribal members. And I knew their history. They knew I knew their history, so I was a threat to them as well. But we had to address those attitudes, and it did take a lot of different training sessions. It wasn't done overnight, and we haven't changed everyone's attitude. But a lot of those officers that were in on that original training have changed over the years to a point where they're very stressed and they're frustrated with this whole issue because they know that we have a lot of it. But they've become friends of the system. The other thing that the statute did was require a mandatory sentencing policy on part of the judges. It was mandatory sentencing, first offense of 30 days flat, without exception. There was no probation, there was no parole. It was 30 days in jail, period, plus counseling, and then the sentencing went up from there. I think the most that I ever sentenced someone to jail for domestic violence, his third offense was 6 months in jail. And that's because we're courts of limited jurisdiction. Our sentencing power is limited by the Indian Civil Rights Act. It used to be $500 fine or 6 months in jail or both. And then in 1986, the omnibus drug bill was passed, and we were allowed to increase the sentencing power to a year in jail or a $5,000 fine or both. And you can sentence consecutively on different charges. And so that was an added impetus for judges in Indian country to look at what they were doing about some of these situations. Now, the other thing that we ran into is that because of the economic situation on the reservations, some communities have 90% plus unemployment 3/4 of the year. And if someone is lucky enough to have a job, the issue for that whole community is, if we enforce this statute, are we impoverishing families even more by putting someone in jail? And as a judge, I had to say, we have to do it anyway. And there were some very hard decisions that had to be made about what are we going to do for the family if the family reports an incident and we jail the person that has the income. What services are there for the family? Now, that became an issue for social services, because we know that with state regulations, there's all kinds of things that are imposed on families as far as qualification for services. And you can't bend a lot of those, you just can't bend them. It's a problem, it remains a problem. And so you have victims that don't want to pick up the phone or run to a neighbor for fear of losing that income because they have 3, 4, 5, 6 children. And what happens if dad's in jail and mom can't work because all the children are under the age of 10? These are community issues that we have to deal with. It's not just Indian country, but they're out here as well. They prohibit someone from calling. And the idea is, can we address that issue of not reporting? And we're still working on it in our communities. Tribal judges across the board have received extensive training on domestic violence, child abuse and neglect, child sexual abuse. One of the things that tribal judges were encouraged to do was to establish weekly conversations with law enforcement. Tribal judges now are consistently invited to in-service training for police officers so they can sit down at the same table and talk about problems that they're dealing with on a daily basis instead of remaining separate. And I think officers become sensitized to how difficult it is sometimes for judges to weigh things when they're sentencing. At the same time, judges become sensitive to the tremendous amount of stress that officers experience when they're dealing with these problems day after day after day. You cannot leave it at the shop. Some people believe that you can, but I don't believe that you can. It does travel with you when you see so many different things happen to people all the time, and there doesn't seem to be any change in sight for them. The tribal judges in most of the reservations, and I'm really happy to say that probably about 65% of the tribal court systems that are in place and operating have a domestic violence statute. Now, the statute has been broadened and updated in the last 3 years to include elder abuse, because we also know in our communities that we have to acknowledge, and this is a real painful revelation for us, it's been there, but we've been in denial, that our elders are suffering, that we haven't treated them as well as we should be doing culturally in the way that we have been taught. We have let them fall into a state of neglect and abuse because they have adult children who are active users of different forms of chemicals, alcohol, drugs, etc. And they know that the elderly person is still parenting the way that they've always done, of taking care of children, of being very understanding, very forgiving, caring, sharing, etc. And they're not going to say no when John or Mary comes in and says, Mom, give me 20 bucks, and that might be the last $20 for the month, and it's only the 4th of the month, and the Social Security check was yesterday. So we're dealing with elder abuse as well, because there are incidences where elders have been, in fact, physically and sexually abused by their own relatives. So we've had to broaden our codes and bring them into the fold. So that's why I said originally that we're not just focusing on spouse abuse. We're talking violence per se in our communities and what we can do to address it. And it isn't easy, because one of the stumbling blocks for us is the legislature, the tribal governments, and each nation is viewed as sovereign. So one nation cannot dictate to the other what you can do within the context of your own body politic. So they operate as sovereign nations. And one of the interesting things about the early part of educating communities about domestic violence was that we realized, and communities know, our communities are small enough. We have a moccasin telegraph. Everyone knows what's going on. The other problem we have is that police officers oftentimes, and it happens here as well, are prohibited from doing a real solid job because everyone has a scanner. And if you have a scanner and you want to call a relative and alert them that the police are on the way to your house to arrest you because your wife called, because our officers sometimes don't discriminate on the radio, they'll say, I'm going up to John Doe's, his wife called, he slapped her. Well, the relative might call John Doe and say, you better head out, and then they hide each other. So we have a problem with scanners, but we realized that when we were doing early education that there were active batterers on our tribal councils. And when you would go to the tribal council and present information about what was happening, the state of affairs in the community, and you received a negative response from the council, we knew why. And again, it was the attitude, and it was the state of denial that we were operating in early on, because some of the responses that I got from one of the council people where I'm from, the Blackfeet Reservation, was, well, I don't know whether to vote or run. And it was an on-point statement, because he knew that we knew that he was a batterer, and that his wife would never say anything because she didn't want to bring any shame on herself or him because he was elected to the council. And the idea is that council people are not untouchable, because it doesn't matter how much money you make. If you're a batterer, you're a batterer across the board. And those are the types of things that we have to say in the midst of educating our community members, that we have to stop this state of denial that we're in and be honest about what's happening right under our noses, or we're really never going to make any changes. Now, if we talk about children for a little bit, the domestic violence statutes that have been adopted in a lot of Indian communities include everyone. It doesn't mean that someone has to be physically assaulted. If there are instances of extreme fear of assault or violence, the statute reaches that type of incident as well. It covers in-laws, it covers ex-in-laws, because with our extended family, just because you divorce someone doesn't mean that the relation stops there. Oftentimes, things will continue years after a divorce. And the statutes are designed to try and address that, because we know we have a different type of cultural situation with the violence statutes. But children, for example, what's happening right now in a lot of Indian communities, and we've had Head Start since about 1976. When I was a sophomore in high school, I worked as a Head Start aides in the summer. And at that time, I didn't know what I was seeing, because I was still in the midst of trying to realize what had happened to me growing up in a family of violence. So I didn't know what I was seeing with these little children. But you take 20 years later and a lot of education and a lot of self-realization. When I went back to my tribe to work in 1988, I was invited by the council one day to go up to the Head Start program for lunch. They have invite your favorite councilman to lunch every month or something like that. And they invited me to go along, and I was happy to do that, because I wanted to see what the Head Start program had done since 1976. And the classroom that we went into, there were about 15 little children that were, 3, 4, and 4.5 years old. And sat down, and the teacher had some things to say, and the food was put out, and they started serving themselves. And in the midst of that, I had an opportunity to observe what was going on around me amongst the children. And to my right and to my left, there were boys and girls, and they were constantly in a state of motion like this. And they were scuffling and grabbing each other and playing and teasing. But the way that they were playing and teasing was really inappropriate, because it was based on violence that they had been exposed to at home. And they were playing mom and dad on this side, and they were grabbing their shirts and pulling and trying to bite and pull hair and stuff. And one little boy felt really assaulted. You could see that he was uncomfortable with this. But the other boy that was doing it was smiling and laughing like this is funny. And it isn't funny, because I knew what I was seeing at that point. And it really brought me a lot of sadness. But then I thought I can feel sad and just stop there with my feelings, or I can say something. And I had an opportunity after that to talk to the teacher and ask her if she was aware of some of the behavior in the room, and she said yes. And, well, what is being done to address this? Well, not much at that particular point, but 2 years later, what they instituted in that Head Start program was a child and family counseling component where they actually hired family therapists who are Indian people. We didn't have very many graduating at that particular point, but now, you know, thank goodness for Bozeman, they have a child and family therapy program, and we had 2 individuals that graduated from there, a man and a wife team who were both tribal members that got their masters in child and family therapy. And they were hired by Head Start. And so what they said was, okay, we can not only provide therapeutic services to these children, we have to bring the family in, and that's that treating the family as a unit concept, again, that works so well in our communities. And that's what they've been doing. They've been engaging families in the whole process of perhaps getting information for the first time on what's proper parenting, the effects of violence on a family, little programs like Good Touch, Bad Touch, Caution Without Fear, Who Do You Tell, things like that, educating the family as a system so that they have a new chance, if you will, of doing some things that are different. If the parents are survivors of violence and they now have children and they're not aware how these things are being recycled, well, they have an opportunity now, and it's really happening across Indian country in our Head Start programs. And I know that I don't want to take too much time. You need to get on with the morning program. But I guess the purpose this morning was to give you some information so that you know that there are things happening out there in Indian country. A lot of communities also have battered women shelters, but we need to say battered families, not just battered women, battered families. So I would leave you with that. Thank you.
Very briefly, I'm going to ask each panel member to introduce themselves and say just a little bit about what their work is with domestic violence and their reason for being here. All of the people who were able to attend are members actively of Missoula's Family Violence Council. Bonnie Craig has been a part-time sort of intermittent interest member with the Family Violence Council, and it does not look like she was able to attend this afternoon. Also, we have a substitution. Christina Swanson is a victim advocate with the City Attorney's Office. She was called to work today because she had to help victims with restraining orders. And Kelly Slattery Robinson has generously agreed to sit in on very short notice. My name is Judy Wang. I'm an assistant city attorney with the City of Missoula. I'm very interested in domestic violence cases. I spend a large percentage of my time prosecuting domestic violence cases, and I am currently the chair of the Missoula Family Violence Council, and I'm also chair of the legislative committee of the Missoula Family Violence Council. A couple real quick housekeeping things before I ask the rest of the panel to introduce themselves. We'd like to field questions from the audience, but if anyone feels uncomfortable about standing up and asking a question, please feel free to write it down on a scrap of paper, and some of the workers from the conference will be walking up and down the aisles from time to time to pick up a scrap of paper question. Also, if you don't remember one of our names, that's just fine. You can refer to the brochure to get our names, but otherwise I don't think any of us would be offended by being referred to by our title or our function in the domestic violence field. I'm fine with prosecutor. Dee is a counselor. Klaus is an attorney with family services, with legal services. Kelly Slattery Robinson is a shelter coordinator. Ed Brannon is a lieutenant with the county sheriff's department, and Judge Harkin is a district court judge. Dee, would you go ahead with your introduction?
You can also refer me to as Hey You with the balloons. My name is Dee Lundberg, and as Judy said, I'm a counselor. I work primarily with batterers here in Missoula. I kind of got into this business through the back door 8 years ago, working at a drug and alcohol center before there was really staunch domestic violence laws, and I was getting people referred to us because they didn't have anywhere else to send them. So I just kind of took it upon myself at that point to take every college course, every workshop I could find to feel confident about what I was doing, and it's turned into, unfortunately, there's job security at this point. I guess that's why I'm here. It's become a personal interest through what I was saying through my drug and alcohol practice originally, and now I do both. Some of the folks, if I can work it out, I will beg and plead for judges to order additional treatment. So I feel like in some ways I have a advantage there to sometimes get folks in treatment longer. I think that's it.
Can you go ahead, Klaus?
My name is Klaus City. I'm the managing attorney of the Missoula office of Montana Legal Services Association. For the past 25 years, Montana Legal Services has represented low-income, needy Montanans throughout this state. There are about 200,000 low-income Montanans. There are 25 legal services attorneys in a good year. Right now, we have for the last for those 25 years, about half of those years, we focused our family law caseload on domestic violence out of sheer necessity with the numbers. For 21 of those years, I've been involved in advocating for victims and victims of domestic violence. As many of you know, those of you that are involved in the same field, oftentimes that's a singular and lonely job out there. And seeing all of you people, interested, concerned, dedicated, and committed people, gives me strength, and I think probably the rest of the panel here and all of us should be proud of the fact that we're all in this together and working together. It helps me on those days when I think, oh, what's the use? We've been faced in legal services for a long time with increasing funding cuts. As I mentioned, about 200,000 Montanans, or 1 out of every 5 roughly, is eligible for our assistance. Our priorities for the last 15 years or so has in the family law area has focused only on domestic violence issues with an occasional they can't do that kind of case as well. And unfortunately, that means that legal services is involved in the most difficult of the difficult cases. Family law represents the single highest priority of legal services offices nationwide in the types of cases that they represent. Judy Wang commented earlier that to several others of the panel that one thing that's significantly absent from our presence here, however, are those attorneys that deal and work in family law areas. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 or so out there, but generally they're not here. And that's a significant problem for those of us that are involved in family law and deal in domestic violence issues. Let me underscore and emphasize her observation. A family law case is the single most difficult case that I have not only to do, but also to refer to the private bar in those situations that I can't do the case. Remember that MLSA, Montana Legal Services, is frequently that office of last resort for those individuals that seek our assistance. We clearly turn away more than 2/3 of those people that seek our assistance with the numbers that we have. We can only represent those individuals that are eligible for our services, both financially and according to our priorities. And frankly, again, we turn well more than 2/3 away. Jackie Garcia commented as well that we shouldn't shun being political. So with that in mind and the risk of offending some, I'll be blunt. For the last, all of the decade of the 80s and for the early part of the 90s, legal services was defunded in the federal budget. We had 0. Fortunately, we had a sympathetic Congress that continued to fund us nevertheless. And while things are changing slightly, there is still a sizable number of people in Congress that think legal services should be eliminated. My question to candidates for public office always has been, if we don't represent those people that are eligible for our services, who will? Casey Gwynn commented already that the criminal justice system is a prime player in this process and problem of domestic violence. Well, the civil justice system, it seems to me, is often the weaker partner of this scenario. Imagine, if you will, a slightly different twist on the problem that he mentioned, the woman whose corporate counsel husband has come to the hospital. Let's imagine further that instead of coming to the hospital first, he grabs the kids of their relationship, takes them to his parents' house, and then comes to the hospital. What do you think is in the primary focused mind of that individual while he's spending the next few days in the hospital? What's going to happen to those kids? And when she comes out and tries to go get those kids, even with her restraining order in hand and with her abuser in jail, and the parents, his parents say no, that's when she's going to come to my office or an office like mine throughout the country. And when she understands that she's not eligible for my services because of both my resource limitations and hers, where can I send her? That's where the civil justice system seems to me to break down most for victims of domestic violence. This is where she's really abused, frankly. And if she survives the next 12 or more months of a custody battle, then I think you could really call her a survivor. And those are my observations on the civil end of it. And we'll take your questions as we go on.
Hi, I'm Kelly Slattery Robinson. I'm the shelter coordinator for the YWCA Domestic Violence Assistance Center. I'm here in Missoula, Montana. And I was asked about 5 minutes ago to be on this panel, so I have nothing prepared. And as everyone's eyes stare at me, I'm like going, why did I say yes? So we'll just try to get through this. My interest in this issue, I think, came out of being a social worker. Graduating from the social work department, I did my social work practicum at the shelter and wanted to stay and got the opportunity to stay. I think that the issue started in my desire to assist women and children, the whole women's issue idea. Now that I've been in this work for 6 years, I am really into the fact that this is a community issue, something that I feel needs to have everybody's input and work, or we're never going to solve it. Just on the shelter point of view and some things regarding the shelters in Montana and all the Battered Women's Program in Montana, I cannot speak for them, I guess, but on my end is that we're terribly underfunded. We have a 5-bedroom facility that's consistently and constantly full. 2 weeks ago, we had 8 women and 15 children in a 5-bedroom facility. We have 2.5 paid staff people, and the rest is run by volunteers. I think volunteers are extremely important in this movement. It's very important to keep the grassroots effort, but it's also important that you can have paid staff that can be consistent and be there. And I know that I'm not the only program that's running on a shoestring, working really hard, working very, very hard. I just met with Shirley, who's from Glendive, and she is the only paid staff person. She works part-time, and luckily has a sympathetic boss for her other part-time job that lets her do things during her work there. So that's just some of my perspective, and I guess that's all.
My name is Ed Brannon. I'm a detective lieutenant with the Missoula County Sheriff's Department here. I'd like to say I've had about a month to prepare for this, and she's probably better prepared than I would be. I've been in law enforcement for 20 years. I spent about 16 of that as a patrol officer, not all here in Missoula. I've seen domestic disturbances over that many years and how things have changed as far as the response that law enforcement has towards that, the attitudes. Some of the attitudes are still there. Part of my responsibility at the Sheriff's Department in Missoula is I'm in charge of crimes against persons, which includes, obviously, domestic abuse cases. I almost exclusively deal with those myself, or assign them for follow-up if need be. Our patrol officers, we feel, do a real good job of getting a basic offense documented there. Anything needs followed up, I deal with that, make referrals to the victims' advocates, and so forth. One of the, excuse me, I'm losing my train of thought here. Like I say, I also deal with an awful lot of, or try to be when we have a victim that isn't satisfied with how the officers may have handled it, an intermediary to go in there and talk to them and make things right. Try to be the liaison with our patrol officers to kind of get them to understand a little bit better about what's going on. I think this council that's been formed has been a tremendous asset to this, just because we as law enforcement have an opportunity to talk to victims and advocates and other people, and they can see where we're coming from, and I just feel, all in all, that makes for a better situation as far as dealing with these.
I'm Doug Harkin. I'm one of the district judges in Missoula. I was born in Sydney and raised in Glendive, and we had no domestic violence in my house, as far as I knew, except for the spankings I received starting about age 6 to about 14 or 15 when I got too big and got smarter than my father. But I don't have a background in family violence like our previous speaker does with grandparents that were involved, and never really thought much about it. Just wasn't talked about in eastern Montana. And I first became involved in it, I started prosecuting cases back about 1970. And I was a county attorney in Hamilton for 8 years. And I got to have a working familiarity with the problems associated with domestic violence. But when I became a judge, I was of the opinion, as I mentioned earlier, that judges should not become involved in that because of perceived bias toward a victim. But after talking to Judge Edwards down in California, I realized that I could become involved. And so when I returned from that school, that coincided with my daughter's entry into high school. And I was absolutely appalled at the stories that she would tell me about the way the boys treat the girls in high school. They swore at them all the time, they called them rotten names, they pushed them around, and we didn't do that when I went to high school. And I realized that there's a mindset that seems to have, at least in this community, it seems to be changing, in that it seems to be all right for the guys, high school age anyway, to push women around and to talk bad to them. And so I realized that I could do something about this, and for my own daughter's sake and for every other daughter that's around, something should be done. And a judge has a little more influence maybe than most people, and so I thought I would use some of my influence. And Missoula had a very good network of persons involved in family violence, and what they needed to do was sort of have an umbrella group, and I was able to help with that a little bit. I want to give credit where credit is due to my friend here at the table. Judy Wang, who is our chairperson, is just the absolute best person to run this organization. She keeps us all, as they say, quote, on task. And we move right along with our meetings, and without her, I think at least I would be wandering around, and maybe some of the others would too. So as we go through our panel discussion, please address most of your questions to her, because I'm sure she's able to answer.
Good afternoon. I guess before I start, I want to ask how many representatives we have from Montana's 7 Indian reservations. Can I see a show of hands? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Well, my name is Bonnie Craig, and I'm Director of Native American Studies at the University of Montana. I have a law degree from that same institution, and I have past experience as a tribal judge, a court prosecutor, and a court administrator, and I've worked as a police radio dispatcher. And I guess the bottom line today is that my experience with domestic violence and family violence generally is that I'm one of the survivors. I know what it's like from the inside out to grow up in that particular type of situation. It's not a pleasant one. And living in Missoula for the past 14 years, it's also been my experience that we have a sizable Native community here representing about 25 different tribes. Most of you probably don't know that. And inside of Montana, we have about 47,000 Indian people from the 7 reservations, and including a few from other reservations from out of state. about 60% of those reside on the reservation. The rest are located in the urban settings or in small towns that are close to the reservation. And we Native people know that we have a problem with family violence. It's there in our statistics that are cited day after day after day. But one of the problems is that there has been a consistent lack of representation or inclusion on the agenda. And in a state the size of Montana, we have to look at that and say, what are we doing for each other? We cannot say the word community unless we mean everybody, not just those that are most familiar to us, but everybody that faces this problem has to be included. And it is critical for programs to network with each other, to share information, and to support each other. And that doesn't mean that you can operate in a vacuum when you want to address this problem, because the officers in Missoula, the judges in Missoula, the social workers in Missoula, the domestic violence shelter people know that occasionally they will have a Native American client. And there are some distinct cultural considerations when you're working with people that are going through a problem like this. And I would start and stop by saying that domestic violence, family violence, as we know it, crosses all socioeconomic barriers. It also crosses all racial lines. But when you're looking at the problem inside from a cultural context, you feel like you're the only one that this is happening to, that it's only your family that this is happening to. And so we have to really be careful of the message that we're sending and make sure that we're not sending a message to people that there's a lot of superiority involved when you're addressing this problem, because you cannot be superior about it. You have to be real, you have to be genuine, and you have to address people where they're at. And if they're in a situation of violence, you know, we just cannot be judgmental, we cannot be blaming, we cannot preach separation. We have to preach solution. And I don't represent all the Indian people in Missoula. I know a lot of them. I don't represent all the Indians in Montana. I know a lot of them as well. But I am knowledgeable about some of the solutions about better communication and inclusion. Thank you.
Questions for the panel? I guess I'd make a request that those of you that feel comfortable asking questions from the audience stand up and ask your question, and then I'll ask the presenters to please stand up when they reply. Questions? Or written questions?
I have a question. Within your Missoula experience, you have different courts that deal with domestic violence, specifically your justice courts and municipal courts. Do you find that there's a disparity between how each court handles cases, and is that a problem? And what have you addressed a solution for that?
Possibly both.
I think that's a really good point. We do have 2 justice courts and a municipal court, and I think cases are handled quite a bit differently in the 3 courts. And frankly, it isn't something that we've taken on directly. I know there's problems with, especially sentence compliance follow-up. We aren't as consistent as we should be. It's a goal, and frankly, I can honestly say that at least in the municipal court, we are doing a lot better than we used to, but we aren't where we need to be going yet. Dee, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, from my end, dealing with the batterer and getting the, having them ordered over to me for treatment and working with compliance situations, I have found the municipal court at this point, I think because of some of the personalities in there, being real knowledgeable about this issue, but a lot better networking, a lot closer contact. I guess I've kind of found myself in the position of, this is going to sound smug, but educating a little bit some of the district court in how it would work best. For instance, one of the things I find extremely helpful in dealing with the batterers is having the police report, so that when they tell me their version, I can say, well, that's funny. Now this says, those kind of things actually are great little denial busters. And I was never getting those from the other court, so I have to, with each case, call and request it. With municipal court, it's automatically sent to me. I think it'll happen, but that we do need to really pursue them. And as far as once they are non-compliance, I think both courts handled pretty well at that point, getting the non-compliance out, tracking that person down, holding them accountable to get back in or do the jail time, which, funny thing, they usually call me up and had spaced it out or something. They come back and finish most of the time.
Question?
Could I add a little bit to that? For those of you that aren't familiar with how these crimes work, it's important that you know that the first time is a misdemeanor, and that's in the justice court. The second time, it's a misdemeanor, and it's in the justice court. The third time, it becomes a felony in my court. And that's the problem that we have, that I have, is that by the time the case arrives to me, this is a serious problem. But nothing has been done seriously about it until now. And ordinarily, I'm looking at a person with a suspended sentence, maybe a day in jail. I don't talk in my court in sentences in terms of days. We do years. And it's a big, big jump between a day in jail, 2 days in jail, the rest suspended, and a year or 2 years in the state prison. It's too big of a jump for me to do when they say he's never really had a chance, now we can do something seriously with him. What I would like is, for those of you that are involved with this, press for big sentences all the way through from the first time, so that I will be more comfortable, the prosecutor will be more comfortable, and the defense will have less of an argument to be able to say, he has to go to prison. We've tried a month in the county jail on the first time, or maybe not that long, but at some period of time. The second time, another long period of confinement, so that by the time they arrive in my court, the sentence that I give, which will be a major sentence, is proportionate to the trend that we've started, and we can see, forget the treatment, this man is dangerous and should go to prison. So in answer to your question, we need the help at the front end in order to load up at the back end.
I'd like to just briefly piggyback that with my experience on my end of the value of jail time. As a therapist, you know, a lot of folks would like to think that if they just had some good counseling, that'd do it. But I think most of us are more likely aware that with a lot of these issues, domestic violence in particular here today, consequences are what move people. People don't move without pain. And the day in jail can be easily forgotten if they get it. So I truly support, someone had asked earlier about, you know, is jail time enough? No, but that doesn't mean it's not real valuable. And that's not to be harsh, just the way it is.
A question for Lieutenant Brannon. I've had some of the ladies who have temporary restraining orders and call 911 and say, you know, the guy's violating it or something. They seem to have the feeling that a lot of times the reports are not being written. Because when they later go back to the victim's advocate and say, you know, he's done this, this, and this, they call for the reports and there aren't any. Have you people in the sheriff's office, and possibly you could speak for the police department also, done a survey like San Diego did of the number of your calls that are domestic violence and the number of reports that are being written, and have you noticed a climbing incident of the reports being written?
Sure. As a matter of fact, I started taking my own because now I'm talking for the sheriff's department, and I'm sure the city police probably have more overall just because of the population. From July of '93 till July of 1994, I categorized 350 domestic abuse reports that were written. It's not exclusively domestic abuse because I also include in that TRO violations. Domestic abuse, TRO violations, because generally they're related. Sometimes it's a stalking TRO. So I would say probably 250 domestic abuse reports that were written. I do go to the computer. We have it's a computer-aided dispatch. I will pull it up daily to show how many, what we call 371 call or domestic calls, again, just in the county. And it looks to me like, because I do review those occasionally, and there's probably 30% of those, just like the sergeant from San Diego spoke about down in the area, 20 to 30% of those are reports written versus how many calls you go out on. But quite often when you pull those up, you will see that they may not have been a valid domestic abuse call. It may have been dispatched to something else. It might have been someone yelling out the door at a dog. Yeah, I think it's more and more we're really trying to emphasize, because the law requires that when there is not an arrest made, there will be a report written, and I always try to emphasize that. But that kind of gives you an idea. Now, as far as the TRO violations, the same thing. Our system here, both for us and the city police, the 911 has it on record down there. I can't really say, because now that you've brought that issue up, I've never really pulled up that TRO violation dispatch to see when someone goes out on that, whether there's actually a report written. I can say that I get a lot of TRO violation reports, and I think our patrol guys are pretty good about it, but I'm sure there are probably cases where they may not consider that, well, as all he did was just kind of drive by on the street, and they may not write that. And I always try to emphasize to our guys the importance of that. But that would be a real interesting thing for me to check to see on those. But we get an awful lot of TRO violations, and they're followed through with on most cases. There's copies taken down to the prosecutor for them to deal with or make their decision on it.
One last follow-up for this city, and maybe Jim and you guys can correct me if I misstate anything. Some of the statistics I'm not familiar with, if we're even keeping them. I know as far as the number of domestic abuse arrests, and I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but the city of Missoula's number of arrests has about tripled in about 6 years. It's gone way up very, very quickly. And I don't believe that's all an increased incidence. I think that's just a really good job of law enforcement taking the problem more seriously. The number of TRO violations, we just this year started keeping track of, so we can't compare what we weren't keeping track of before, but the City of Missoula Police Department had a policy shift, 6 months ago, and Jim Newmeyer was real instrumental in getting that going, that temporary restraining orders used to go to a civilian desk person who was working a 24-hour desk, and the desk person would make a report and nothing further would be done. And all TRO violations are to be referred to a uniformed patrol officer, and I think that's happening in virtually all of the cases now. Doesn't mean all officers are issuing a citation as a result of that, but they're at least investigating it, and most of their supervisors say, well, look, if somebody did it and you believe there's probable cause, you go ahead and write the citation. Jim, any follow-up on that?
No, other than the fact that if one of our civilian desk personnel does take a TRO violation over the phone, it's policy now that she in turn turns it over to the on-duty shift commander, who is responsible for signing that violation out. And without getting into numbers, there's a real strong likelihood that a citation will either be issued or mailed out to that person. We're not real tolerant. It's probably a good word. Any kind of violation, even if it's a slight one, we'll usually mail or cite the defendant in court.
I guess the last follow-up then, if you hear a complaint about an officer, that's one of the things the Family Violence Council wants to do. They can come to the Family Violence Council, and complaints will go through Ed with the SO or through Jim with the City Police Department. And if there's a concern, it could be that the officer took the exactly appropriate action for a number of reasons, or if there's a problem that an officer isn't taking an offense as seriously, that's something we want to deal with as well. Questions? Ma'am?
This isn't exactly a question, but it is an observation and a concern of mine. The state law says that if someone who has been arrested for domestic violence is supposed to take 25 hours of counseling. And I'm wondering if there was any way, because of the cases that I have known of, they are to take anger aggression counseling. But there's a terrific difference between anger aggression counseling and domestic violence counseling. And I'm wondering if there's any way that that can be addressed. Specifically, if someone is supposed to
Yeah, I refer to mine as a domestic abuse / anger management program, but it is designed for the domestic abusers. Honestly, sometimes it helps them show up because it sounds softer. Okay, and then I can deal with it. It's called professional manipulation.
I'm not sure if this will answer your question. The statute currently is what I call squishy on what it requires, and we are working as the Family Violence Council on some legislative proposals. We haven't specifically taken on the counseling requirements because Montana does have the problem that there are locales where it's incredibly rural, and if we set up a counseling program that is very, very specific and all counseling providers must have a PhD or 18 initials after their name, we're not going to have something that's going to work out. One of the things we're proposing for the next legislative session is a counseling assessment prior to counseling, and then a minimum of 25 hours of domestic violence counseling, and other counseling is recommended by the counseling provider. And what we're trying to do is move probably with baby steps towards a little bit more sophisticated program, but I don't think we're ready to jump to 1 year of counseling right now. Question? Ma'am.
Does anybody on the panel have any idea about child support, deadbeat fathers? I'm really confused on that.
Well, it really doesn't have anything directly to do with domestic violence, but child support. Sure.
They hold it over you when they don't pay it.
Sure. Child support in this country is a national tragedy. The record is still that the average child support payment is about $73 per month per child. Montana is a little bit better than that because we've adopted some guidelines which the legislature has, in its wisdom, decided to make mandatory, and the judges follow those pretty rigorously. That's the good part. The bad part is enforcement, and the Child Support Enforcement Agency, if you think the waiting list is long to get into my office, try knocking on their door once. They're at least 3 to 4 months behind on prosecuting or moving toward even administrative collection of child support. And for the victim that now has her children, she's out of the hospital and is trying to make it on her own, the chances are that her only remedy will probably be either relying on her relatives, her own resources, or the welfare department until the court has the opportunity to deal with that issue, because child support enforcement is not going to get to it any faster than the court process.
Question, Ben?
I have a question concerning the present state of Montana law as it relates to what was brought up at literally all the seminars today around having to have the witness or the victim be a witness. What is the state, the actual state of Montana law?
I think all of the things that were discussed were evidentiary, and we do have rules of evidence that are based, I believe, on the federal rules of evidence and are very similar to most other states. And the evidentiary rules are the same, and it would not be a problem. We'd have to have investigative techniques so that we can apply those rules, but I don't think there's any rule of Montana law that would exclude those. Okay, ma'am?
I was wondering if interventions involved in domestic violence are primarily seen as being deterrence or used as curative, if the intent is curative.
Well, I can only speak for my part of the process. I've taken, not personally, but I've heard a lot about, the 25 hours of counseling. Obviously, in a majority of the cases, really isn't enough. But from where I stand ethically, I'm in it not to warehouse them. I'm in it for, to try and turn it around, to try and be curative. To try and talk them into staying on, to try and talk them into going into some drug and alcohol counseling too, the best I can with what I got. And I can only speak for what it is I do. I mean, I really believe that change can be made, and if I didn't, I don't belong in the business.
My understanding is that they perceive it as being punishment, that punishment only deters.
And that's usually one of the very first things the first time I see them, that's one of the things that comes up that we try and work through. Yes, there's a punishment element here. Let's talk about why you might need to be here and focus on that. sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't.
Question?
I was wondering from the attorneys and the judges on this counseling issue, who has the power, if the state law is kind of squishy, who has the power? Can a judge say in a district court like a justice court, can you say what kind of counseling they should go to?
Yes.
So you could choose someone in a community and say, you need to go there, or you need to do this kind of counseling, or?
I try not to be person-specific, rather say, this looks like an alcohol-based problem or a hostility-based problem or something like this, and direct them in that way. Usually, I leave it up to the probation officer to make that decision. In district court, I have that privilege. In justice court, they don't have probation officers. So they have to sort of, and in city court, they have to kind of wing it on their own.
But do they have the power to direct where the person should go?
Yes. They do have the power to direct where they go. What we've done in municipal court isn't necessarily a perfect system, but we had some problems a few months ago, and Judge Harkin helped write a letter to all of the judges. We had a couple judges who were sending, and I don't have any problems with some kind of religious counseling, but there were abusers who were going through and then being sent to their minister to get counseling to quit being violent, and it was not appropriate at all. We wrote a letter to all of the judges, described, and when I say squishy, there are some standards in the statute. It's just not very, very specific and very, very tight, as would be ideal. The judges do have the ability to say where the abuser can go, and what we've done in municipal court is we have a list of court-approved counseling providers, and the abuser, when they go through, in Missoula, we currently have 2 counseling providers. Dee's program is one, and then there's another. They're given that sheet. If they want to vary from the sheet, then they have to go find their counseling provider and give at least some information about the counseling provider and why that's appropriate, and the court can approve. There's a concern that judges don't want to say, be caught in a situation where somebody would say, oh, well, you're just making a whole lot of money for Dee Lundberg. Well, they're not, but independent of that, they don't want to be called on some kind of bias, but that's the way we've gotten around it, because we are concerned about inappropriate counseling, and if there aren't restrictions, there will be inappropriate counseling. Sir?
It seems like there's a lot of experts. Everybody thinks they're an expert in domestic violence just because they think they have an answer. And it seems like it's very, real different answers. I'm wondering about how long and what it takes to possibly endorse counselors or certified counselors as domestic violence, and how do we do that on a state level? Like we've done it with CD counselors, and even there, it's still pretty wide open. But this seems like, like the minister's an expert, and this one's an expert, and who knows?
And I think that's, the chemical dependency certification is a really good example of a way we can attempt to control that a little bit. I would have no problem at all going through a process to become a certified domestic violence counselor if I knew where to go to do that. I think we need systems like that for the very reason, because it's tremendously loose, and most of us have gotten into it sheerly for lack of a place and having some experience with it, whether we grew up with it or, drug and alcohol business, certainly you do see a lot. We've been dealing with it for years. And then taking it upon yourself to go to Duluth or to go to these places and get what you can. But yeah, hopefully, from where I'm sitting, we could move towards an actual certification system. It's a large enough issue that it is merited beyond question.
It seems like that would offer a lot of protection even for people who are, then you wouldn't be there doing it to make money, but what they're colluding.
I'm not.
All those rather than saying this person has earned, they've invested in themselves to be credible. And so that's what we're looking for as a court, rather than specific programs, the actual, are the individuals certified or
Marilyn?
Judge Harkins mentioned this, that there are no probation officers to supervise those cases out of justice.
question is misdemeanor probation, basically, for domestic abusers. From my perspective, it would be extremely helpful. I think it's very, very important, and it is one of our legislative proposals that that could be set up.
We're pressing the commissioners right now to hire a probation officer for the justice courts. We'll see.
Vivian?
I had a question for Lieutenant Brannon, and I think that we've come a long way within the law enforcement arena in this issue. And I know, Missoula is probably one of the communities that needs to be applauded at both the city and county level. I wonder, from your perspective here in our locale, and also if you could statewide, if you have any knowledge, give us some kind of impression about if you think that law enforcement has moved, to a really great degree, or if we still have a lot of room in this area. And within, what I'm trying to say is, in the law enforcement arena, if law enforcement officials are responding according to the kind of protocol that we would hope that they would respond. And also, is if that isn't the case for an individual law enforcement officer, what kind of follow-up happens with that? If, for instance, a call is made and someone responds, and then in the traditional manner just has the guy go out, take a walk around the block, and pat a little woman on the head and say, please try to mash the potatoes better next time. If those things happen, what kind of disciplinary measures or what kind of efforts are made by your office or any other office that you're familiar with? Do you understand?
Sure. Yeah. First off, and again, my impression, and I really can't speak for any other part of the state. When I worked in another part of the state, but it's a long time ago. But in I believe it was 1984 when the domestic abuse law came into effect. I recall the first law enforcement meeting that we went to because of that, because they're explaining the law. It's new, and there was this mysterious thing about it's an exception where you can no witnesses, the guy goes to jail, and you can arrest him in other places. There are just laws that did not apply, and you're not going to have a cooperative. There was this big concern of this change as to what's going to go on. Personally, I think, and most law enforcement officers right now will tell you that domestic abuse law probably helped us as much as it did anybody, even if it was from the real shallow point of standing in a room with two people arguing, and you can't really take anybody to jail, and it's a matter of bartering to who's going to leave the house tonight. She may not want him arrested, but he doesn't want to leave the house, that kind of a thing. But there was obviously some type of violence, and you'd find yourself in those kind of things. Usually she'd end up leaving and going to the shelter. That was our big standby, was the shelter. It's the only thing that could help us out. Domestic abuse law came along. You see any signs of violence in there, your problem is solved real fast. He goes to jail. Most of the time, 90% of the time, he goes to jail. So it's come a long ways. The big thing that I still see is, that you still get the attitudes, of that, and I hear it to this day of the, well, what about her, and I think our guys, and I think I can pretty safely say this, and I'm probably biased, I think they're pretty good about it. They may kind of think that way, but I think they're doing it appropriately and writing those reports and everything. But I have had victims that come in where a patrol officer may not have written a report that night, and they come in the next day and they say, well, where's my case at? And we try to say, well, geez, we don't have any report at all. And sometimes, whether they get busy or whatever it is, or misjudge something out there, don't write a report. They come in, and in cases like that, as far as any discipline or anything like that, I mean, if there's a real problem there, it's their captain of the patrol division that deals with that. There's always another side to the story over there, but we try to deal with it like that. I can't really say that there is has been any real discipline kind of things, other than the fact of the training officers dealing with them out there. We've got 3 pretty good field training officers say, hey, we need these on these reports. You don't tell people this. This is kind of like you're right out of the Stone Age. I think we're getting less and less of those people than there have been, just because of awareness. The basic training of domestic abuse is now in the academy. It never was when I was there. Just kind of understanding this a little bit better. So I don't know whether I've totally answered that or not, but there's, we occasionally will still get where, well, this officer just wasn't all that polite. Well, you know, sometimes you can't do anything about that. We like to have our guys leave a good impression. If they really, you know, don't make an arrest when there should have been an arrest made, I mean a real problem there that can cause, you know, further criminal activity or negligence or something like that, we'll certainly address that, and if necessary, a discipline type of a problem. But
Well, I guess, just if I could, just to follow up on that, what I'd like to know is, you know, more about the accountability issue. I mean, what I'm hearing you say is, you know, this sort of is happening, you know, but we try to live within it, within the system, given the fact that they're busy and whatever.
Right.
Whatever kinds of reasons there are. But where in the system can the public go to receive more accountability if, in fact, that's a need? Other than, you know, mounting a huge campaign. I don't even know if this is a
Right.
problem, but I think it may be a problem in other parts of the state.
Sure. Well, basically, I can tell you right on a personal level what happens when a citizen comes in and this investigation's been botched up. I'll tell you who's accountable for it. I am, and I'm the one that does it from the ground up there. Other than that, if there is a real problem, you know, of course, it has to go right to the sheriff as far as that goes, in which then it gets into the old chain of command dealing with his captain. I think our sheriff and our administrators here are real receptible to complaints from the public about things like that. You know, I don't think it will be, I don't know whether there's a fear that, well, it'll just be kind of shoved aside and nobody will pay attention to it. No, I think they really will. I guess that's the best that I can answer it as far as, I encourage people, you know, if you've got a complaint, please come in and tell us about it, because I don't like to have a black eye either. I'm a part of this department, and if something's not right out there, we want to get it straightened out. Ultimately, our sheriff here. You know, and other than that, there's really nothing in the judicial system that addresses that kind of a thing, unless you're dealing with negligence. Okay.
Question? Diane?
How does one go about getting more training for law enforcement officers, both at the academy and at the local level? Is this only a legislative move? Is there some type of movement that occurred in California that, you know, that initiated this? How as an interested individual or a social worker or a judge or, you know, whatever any of us have to do, how do we get more training? How do we get that either forced or suggested or promoted?
Ed, do you want that, or do you want me to take that?
Yeah, I'll talk just a little bit about that. One of the things that, you know, domestic violence, as far as overall training, understanding that it's recognizing that it's a problem, I think law enforcement has recognized for years and probably has been involved in domestic violence for a long time. You know, whether we handled it like Neanderthals way back there, but we've been involved in it, we've seen it, we know that it goes on. So as far as understanding that, you know, that's, and I think law enforcement's come a long ways as far as doing that. But when you talk about training, the important things is very much this, and this is again my opinion as far as dealing with the domestic violence. It's a crime. We treat it as a crime. In our department, I expect our officers to respond to those calls. They write a report. They take a statement. They photograph injuries. Now, these are our patrol guys. It's not kicked over to detectives later on. They make a prosecutable case as much as they can in the given time they have. And that, as far as the training, it's like you go out to a burglary, you do the same thing. You recognize the evidence. In other words, I see our major objective is to get out there and make a case, understand where the victim's coming from and the self-defense issues and all this, not the mutual combatants. Make a case, turn it over to the prosecutor. Now, as a sideline to that, we like them to understand that domestic violence is a little different than these crimes and that crime, but basically, the main thing I want our officers to do is to bring in a good case, a good prosecutable case with all the evidence that you have in place there. If there's any follow-up, detectives do that. So as far as continuing training, guys that have been around for 15 to 20 years. They've got all the necessary training to investigate and present a case. I think the problem comes in is the, you know, kind of the understanding of the victim's problems and things like that. So, is there someone else who wants to pick up with?
I want to say something.
Sure.
Just as an additional, I think I'm talking to you back there. Another suggestion would be to see an opportunity and seize the moment, if you will. I'm an opportunist, and I did some cultural sensitivity training for Chief Oberhofer here for the Missoula City Police Department. It was well received, and the whole point of it was that we were in the midst of a different, totally irrelevant conversation. And out of that conversation, I discovered that he had some questions about Native American people. And I saw that as an opportunity to ask him if his officers had ever received any type of cultural sensitivity training about Native American culture. And then we talked about domestic violence related issues with that. And he said no, and put me in touch with his training coordinator, and we scheduled that. It took a little time to do that. But certainly there are opportunities, even if an officer has been on the beat for 20 years and he's received 500,000 hours, you know, there's always something out there that he may not have had a lot of time with, and take advantage of that opportunity and make the suggestion.
Question in the back.
I'll offer more of a comment than a question, because I don't think what I have to say is susceptible to being phrased as a question. But I think each and every one of us in this room, especially in Montana, where all the judges stand for elections from the lowest to the highest levels, need to be held accountable for their actions on the bench with regard to how they treat the important subjects I think these days are DUIs, domestics, things like that. Because the council can do its work and get the legislation, get it passed, the legislature, you know, does its job and has its intent. The police officers write a good report, somebody's arrested, it then goes to the prosecutorial system. A person's successfully prosecuted, when it comes to the sentencing stage, then oftentimes nothing happens. And somebody will come back for not going to the 25-hour counseling. Nothing happens. And I think everybody needs to, you know, if this is an important subject to them, begin to pay attention to the way violators are treated in the areas where they live. Because each and every judge stands for election. I point to Judge Harkin because he's a very good example of someone, and I practiced in front of him for a number of years, who lets defendants in all types of offenses, but particularly DUIs, domestics, know that there will be no transgressions, no failure to follow conditions or orders of the court without paying a price. Lots of other judges don't do that, and repeatedly you will see the same person in the system time and time again for failure to comply, and they get no sanction. Judge Harkin is a very good example of somebody who does, in fact, say you don't come back before this court without paying a price. And of all of the judges I practiced in front of the Missoula, and it's almost every one of them, he has the lowest return rate of anybody for any offense because he holds people accountable for their actions. And I think that we as voters can hold other judges who aren't sentencing, you know, according to the way crime should be sentenced for particular offenses. The only way you can hold them accountable and the people that they deal with them is through the ballot box. That's my comment rather than a question.
Thank you, Gary. They'll be delivering your new car. Right, but let me tell you why I do that. Somewhere I read or got the notion that this battering is a power thing. You've heard that before. And he's real powerful around the kids and around home. But when he's faced with a bigger, tougher person, and that's me, he's not so tough. And I've seen this time and time again. And my philosophy is you can do all the treatment that you want, and it's very helpful, but you got to have a bigger dog, and that's me. And that woman needs a champion. And I don't do the white horse thing, but we have sort of a social contract in our society. Back in the old days, you could go hire a guy to beat up the other guy. Well, they still do that in some places. But back in the old days, you could go hire your champion and he would beat up on that other person. Or you could rely on your family or your clan to do that. Well, we don't allow that anymore, and I don't know what I'll do if my daughter or wife ever has a problem like this. I suppose I have to turn it over to the police, right? Well, that's what the way a lot of people feel, is that they have to turn it over to a system that doesn't do justice and doesn't help them out. And so I sort of see my role as being the champion for and doing the things that the victim can't do, maybe would like to do and change their mind, and for all these reasons that victims don't testify. That batterer has got to understand that there's a tougher person out there than him. And I hope that the next time that he thinks about battering again, he'll think, I'd like to do it, and she deserves it, but that son of a bitch Harkin down there is laying for me, and he wants to throw me in jail. Well, I'm not going to give him that chance, right, Gary? And so I want him to think about that, and sometimes I say that to them, like, you may be tough around her, but I'm tougher than you, because I've got these guys to help me, and they carry guns, and they have keys that lock you up, and I want to do that to you. And they don't see people like this very often, and so I may be wrong on my philosophy, but it seems to work. And I intend to keep pursuing it until I'm impeached or something like that.
And I think we need to use every available way there is, because a lot of the guys and gals are not going to repeat again because of legal fare. I'd like it to be because they feel real bad and this and that, but there are some folks that's going to be the deterrent. So hey, use it.
Real quick, one last comment on that last question, and then I'll let you ask a question. Judge Edwards had a suggestion in our small breakout earlier this morning, and it was just a novel idea. I'd never heard of it before. But he plans on doing a judicial review with all his domestic cases. And what that is if someone supposedly gets a year suspended or has some jail time and then followed by a extended suspended sentence, before that sentence is up, he makes an appointment with them, and he's going to do a whole bunch of offenders at one time, but have them all come into the courtroom and discuss the sentence, and discuss how they completed counseling, and discuss whether or not they've maintained a no contact, and discuss whether or not they've quit drinking. And it just seemed like a really wise idea, and they share that information with the abuser when they go through the court the first time. Excuse me, sir, I'm going to be seeing you again in 6 months. Please make a date on your calendar for thus and such a date. And I think that would be a real good compliance measure. Question?
It's not a question, but referring to the 24 hours and 6 months. But it says a person convicted of domestic abuse shall be required to pay for at least 6 months of counseling, totaling at least 25 hours. Then under sub 4C, upon completion of the minimum counseling requirement.
Must be the sense for domestic abuse, I guess.
The problem is that particular subsection isn't being utilized quite the way it was drafted and intended. At least some of the judges, I know I've had at least 10 sentences in a row where I requested that an abuser obtain a minimum of 25 hours of counseling, and any other counseling is recommended by the counseling provider. And it was ignored. It was like I didn't say it, and 25 hours was written down. And at least the advice I've gotten from most counseling providers is that it would be better to have an evaluation up front and then counseling as recommended with a minimum of 25 hours. Question? Ma'am?
Yeah, I have a question for Bonnie Craig. Judge Harkins just talked about how he would like the victims and the perpetrators to view the system. And I guess I'm wondering from a cultural standpoint, how does an Native American population, this may be a very long question, so I guess maybe if briefly, how is it viewed? How is the system viewed? How is all this intervention and these people in our lives viewed by both the victim and the perpetrator or the abuser?
It is an involved question and not easy to answer in about 30 seconds, but I guess I would start with the premise that most Indian people have had a relationship with two different kinds of systems, the state system and then their own tribal system. And
issue here is that if it is family violence, if it is domestic violence, and you have a batterer or you have a victim and they're moving between two different types of systems, there should be some consistency so that they know that they can't leave one area and move to another, and then they're able to get away with something for 6 months or a year, and then they leave there because they're in trouble and they go back to this system, and it's totally inconsistent again. So again, that leads me back to communication. There's got to be some communication across court lines, across police officer lines, so that tribal police officers are communicating with state officers, tribal judges communicating with district court judges, municipal court judges, to find out what the actual position is on sentencing in this area so that there is some consistency. But there are cultural considerations, and I mentioned reactions. A person may either choose to not react or not interact, or they may interact but not react to whatever the judge might be telling them. I know that I've worked with some Indian women who have had a problem with someone in their life that has been abusing them, and there has been a real difficulty because the individual, it doesn't really reside in Missoula full time. They move back and forth between here and Fort Peck or Northern Cheyenne or up at Flathead. And so there's no consistency for that Indian victim here in Missoula because they don't know whether the Missoula police are familiar with that individual, or even when that individual may choose to come back into the city in the dead of night and knock on their door or whatever. And then there's the other trust issue for a lot of victims of violence out there who are Indian. Whether or not they want to pick up that phone and report someone is probably what I've been seeing most consistency in the last 2 years with women, let's say families, that I've come into contact with, is getting them to that point that they can trust a white system to respond to them. And I would like to say that yes, this system can respond and does respond and should respond, but there are families out there who don't pick up the phone and report violence because they don't know if they can trust this system.
When a victim finally gets up the nerve to go in and get a temporary restraining order, what can I do as an advocate? And I'd like to address this to the whole panel to ensure that she will be safe. What kind of steps can be taken? Or is there any assurance that I could give her that once she has that temporary restraining order, she will be safe?
Who wants to go after that first?
I haven't said a word, have I? I guess for me, that in my eyes, and just knowing from some personal experience that a restraining order is not a guarantee that she will be safe. There have been many women in the United States have been. You can't hear me?
I didn't hear that.
Oh, the question. The question was whether, when, as an advocate, and a woman goes in to get a restraining order, what kind of guarantees can we give her that she will be safe with the restraining order? Okay. And that's that. The answer is none. The restraining order is simply a piece of paper. There have been many women in the United States who have been murdered with restraining orders. What you need to do, and what's a good thing, is the safety plans, which the first time I've seen such a great safety plan from San Diego, is to set down some safety plans and try to make it as safe as possible for her. Sometimes we suggest for women to come into the shelter for a few days just to see what kind of reaction he's going to have when the restraining order is served, you know, those types of things. But keep as much of a safety plan, keep that restraining order on her at all times, and just those things. But we cannot guarantee, like I said, the restraining order is a piece of paper. And if the man does not respect the law, and that's what that is.
Jim?
The unfortunate reality here, one of the unfortunate realities, and speaking from the law enforcement aspect, is that if an abuser wants his victim, he's going to get her. There's nothing that we can do about putting somebody with her 24 hours a day, and that's virtually impossible. And it's like Casey Gwynn
couple real quick follow-ups to that. There is a laundry list of things, and I'm sure it's in the safety plan, but one is always keep the restraining order with her at all times. 911 has information about the restraining order, but that gives easy access to a peace officer, exactly what the restrictions are. Always have somebody else with her, vary her routine, check her locks, don't stay at home. I'm sorry, just a list of routine information that you can give to victims to ensure or increase their safety. You cannot ensure their safety. Make sure they always carry a restraining order copy with them. Peace officers, that's their best tool to see whether or not there is a restraining order in place and what the actual provisions are. Always have someone else with them, never be alone insofar as that is possible. Make sure they have good locks, or if their home truly is not a secure place, go stay somewhere else. Vary their routine, both in the city and the county of Missoula. Victims can feel free and should feel free when they feel in danger to ask for extra patrol. It does not mean they have a cop parked in the driveway, but it does mean when the officers are in the neighborhood, they'll drive by and they'll be watching and seeing what the suspect looks like. And we have had, not many, but we have had some TRO violations where the victim didn't even know that the TRO was being violated. Just a peace officer was driving by and was concerned, spotted an offender, and went ahead and made an arrest. Ma'am?
The fact that the woman has a TRO, a copy of the TRO in her possession, that includes the officer who responds that it's been served. So we verified that it's been served through 911. One of the problems we have is that district court issued restraining orders are not in the same file, so unless it's during work week, we can't call district court offices and find out if has a restraining order been filed, does it exist, what are the conditions? Is it possible that we could have the district court restraining orders entered into our computer file the way the justice and municipal court ones are, so that we can verify when we're on the scene, this is learning, I can tell, so that we're on the scene. When we're on the scene, we can radio in and say, check and see if there really is a district court order. She says there is, but she's not at home, she doesn't have it with her, whatever.
Something also the advocates can help their people, their clients, the people they're working with also is, especially when people are going through a divorce, they gather so many papers that they don't know what they have. And so a number of times we're handed drafts of dissolutions, we're handed custody suggestions, we're handed all sorts of paperwork, but nothing that gives us the bite we need to be able to follow through on a TRO, or to be able to say, yeah, this one's signed, this one's dated, this one's valid. You gotta know what you have, and that's something the advocates can really help with.
And on top of that, we don't know who has the most recent TRO. I was with an officer who served one on one day, the next day, she went and got one against her husband, we were back at the same house kicking him out. We don't know who has the most current one unless we have some computer file. The fact that she has one that's a week old, it may already be outdated or overridden by a later issue restraining order. That's why it's nice that we have those, especially the district court ones, in that computer file, so we have a date.
Judge Harkin?
It's a problem. And if we get those problems solved, I think that our family violence counselor here in Missoula will have performed a real service for you. But we've got 7 judges in Missoula all sending out these restraining orders, and each one of us getting affidavits from the most recently abused person, whether it's bogus or not. But it's a problem, and we're working on it. What else can I say?
Last question.
Are you seeing an increase in the amount of cases that you're prosecuting? Are you moving toward prosecuting without the victim statement also?
We've been doing that for years, and we are seeing an increase in cases. All right, thank you very much.
And I won't keep you very long, but I did have some remarks to make over just watching and listening to the program today. And first of all, I really want to thank the organizers of this. I think they really deserve it. with the attendance. I think it shows a great cross-section of Montanans involved in this issue. And I was also pleased to be asked to do this. I cut short a trip to Cairo to get back to do this because it's so important in the state. And I thought that at this point in the day I would be exhausted, but I switched my days around. The night before I left Cairo, I stayed up all night and I slept all the way home on the plane, so I feel okay. It's surprising. I got home last night. And one more comment on that. It's almost as if I'm at a similar conference. In Cairo, they're talking about the same issues, only it's worldwide. There are so many violations of human rights that fall into this arena of domestic violence that it's incredible to be sitting here talking about the Montana issues surrounding violence and know that just a few days ago I was listening to women from the Philippines and women from India, women from Africa countries, and the Middle East talk about similar issues. And it's just rewarding that now people are starting to have those voices be heard. We're doing a lot of things here in the United States that I think that other countries will be modeling after us once they start realizing the good work that we've been doing. I really appreciated Attorney General Joe Mazurek coming today, and I think we all can appreciate the fact that he's using this conference as his springboard to send he and Superintendent Keenan out into the state to really echo what we're discussing here today, to talk to youth so that they will have a safe space to voice their concerns, their experiences. And I'm really hopeful that once we start providing youth with more safe space, that we can again have that as a place to break the cycles of violence. So I applaud Attorney General Mazurek for coming today, using this conference, this important conference, as a springboard for his work within the state. And one thing I thought was interesting, that everywhere you go, we hear more about the batterer or the accused in a very famous California case. But I was encouraged to see that the Attorney General said that domestic violence was highlighted by the death of Nicole Simpson. And I think that the more we talk in those terms and use those terms, that we will start turning people's minds around, that the attention needs to be focused on the victim in a lot of situations when there's sensational cases such as that. Jackie Garcia was exceptional in her presentation by giving us a grounding in good information and accepted principles. Even though a lot of you work in this area and have been through training and know a lot of what she told us, it's always good to go back again and really plow over a lot of that good information, that solid kind of information, that principles that we need to use in our work to keep us grounded, to know that yes, we are on the right track if we're using those principles as a springboard for our work. Just another note from Cairo. Jackie only went back on the historical perspective to talk about that power structure only into the Middle Ages. I was reminded at one panel discussion that I attended in Cairo that by an Islamic feminist scholar, and it seems to be an oxymoron if there ever was one, but that it goes back to Adam and Eve, that God's primary creature was man and woman was secondary, and woman, though secondary in creation, was primary in guilt. So it isn't just this recent happening, that this power struggle, it's been there from time immemorial. And I think it's really important to keep Jackie's words in mind, that we need to keep that power, trying to put that power in a balance so it's more evenly divided. And then I thought another point that she made that was so good to keep reminding ourselves is that batterers come from all walks of life, that none of those areas in our society that we think of are exempt from this dread type of infection, if you will, in our society, that batterers can be those people who are at the top level echelons of our society. Judge Edwards, I thought, was tremendously impressive. I thought, gosh, you know, there are judges and then there are really judges that jump in with both feet and get involved in this kind of thing and really have the confidence to know that this is an arena that is something that, some area that it's appropriate for judicial people, not only appropriate, but he does it with a lot of enthusiasm. I thought that he provided us with an incredible amount of information about structure and outline to create family violence councils. And I did want to make one point that I would argue with him, that I think that as a state legislator, and I know that our budget is strained, but I think that we do need to fight for money for these kinds of efforts that we want to do. I think that we're foolhardy to think that we can do this strictly without, on a volunteer basis, or to extend our own busy schedules, our own commitments into taking on one more effort to try to accomplish successfully. So I would argue that we do need to be there at the table asking to get funding. The breakout sessions I know were good. I attended the one on children, and I think that, again, we had a wonderful amount of good information. I would assume that the other two with training and family violence councils will generate a lot of good discussion among all of us. And then just one note on Casey Gwynn. I think that he was inspirational and provided a lot of clarity, gave us a lot of clarity on where we need to go in the arena of criminal justice. What I was impressed with was he hit home over and over again what really was a highlight for me when I attended a national conference in Chicago in June, that we need to have the public get their minds around this whole issue and look at it in a different way. And the examples he gave us about the 7-Eleven store clerk not having to press charges, I thought was a real appropriate one. If we keep just hammering away at the public that this is not something that we could hide in the family homes, excuse me, but it's something that it's a crime and there is a criminal and the criminal needs to be accountable. And then for him to emphasize that our work needs really to focus on the abuser if we are using the criminal justice system. And finally, the panel here before us this afternoon gave us the confidence that we do have a lot of talented and committed people who are working here in our communities, and we know that we've got those kind of resources. And so I think that we're on a good road. We've done some good work, and we can begin to list our successes very, very well. So I thank you for this time. Just to wrap things up for today's session, I think we have a lot of good work coming before us tomorrow, and we'll be anxious to hear those presentations. So thanks a lot.